The Comstock Lake fire was discovered on June 21st of 2018 and was caused by lightning. By the end of June of that same year, there had been more than 560 wildfires in British Columbia. Hi, I'm Chris May, writer, producer, and host of This Day in Weather History, a podcast now in its second year from the Weather Network in Canada. We pick up in progress and commemorate the date when it was actually discovered or became a mainstream story, leaping from the shadows and into the history books, this day in weather history. Some perspective to start. In the catastrophic wildfire season of 2017, which saw 65,000 people forced from their homes, over 12,000 square kilometers of British Columbia went up in flames. They say a change in weather patterns driven by climate change has pushed things over the edge, bringing warmer, drier weather and more lightning to British Columbia. It was noted that nearly 1/4 of British Columbia's regions were at their highest drought rating, with no significant rain in the forecast and hundreds of fires still burning even by the end of the summer of 2018. The northwestern part of the province was affected by far the worst than any other region in BC, as close to 1 million hectares of land had burned. The next closest is the coastal region, which covers Metro Vancouver, Vancouver Island, and much of the south coast, where just over 150,000 hectares of land had been impacted. That's the disparity between the north and the south. Now, these fires started seemingly out of nowhere and were nearly impossible to contain without a rain event that in itself would have had to have been equally as historical. In total for 2018, just under 1,500 fires were started by lightning and another 443 by human activity. Welcome to year 2 of this podcast. Right now, you're listening to the full version of today's story on your favorite podcast provider, but there's also the daily podcast video short. They're shot right here in my podcast recording studio, so you get that perspective, but oftentimes they will include visuals from that day's event from when it happened in weather history. So after listening to the full story, go check out the podcast video short on television or online anytime at theweathernetwork.com/weather history. And just to dovetail from that if I can, I'd like to remind you where you can catch this podcast if you might be picking this up off our site or from within a story. You can look up or ask for This Day in Weather History, wherever you normally listen to your favorite podcasts, including Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Alexa, and now every day on yahoo.ca. By Labor Day long weekend, initial estimates already out put the 2018 year as the largest burn area in British Columbia wildfire season, surpassing the historic 2017 wildfire season, where then 1.25 million hectares burned. 2018 was over 1.3 million hectares. The Comstock Lake fire would go down as just the start of what would become BC's worst wildfire season in history, but even worse, beating a mark that had only been set 1 year prior when it did that, this day in weather history. Hey, do you like the podcast? We'd love to hear from you. If you have an idea, go right now to wherever you're listening to me and rate us if you would, please. It's on a 5-star system, and we would love as many stars as you can afford. So rate us, but then also review us. This way we can always stay on top of how you'd like to see the show evolve. Then remember to subscribe to this podcast. Click the subscribe or follow button right there on the very same podcast homepage you're listening on. You'll be immediately reminded that the next day is ready to listen to, and you also have access to every episode in the archives. It dates back to June 1st of 2020, so there is a lot that we got to get caught up on this day in weather history. Tomorrow is June 22nd, the date that marks the first and still only F5 tornado ever in Canada, and it happened in Ely, Manitoba. It wasn't immediately surveyed at that strength, no. This one has an interesting story, so make sure you don't miss tomorrow on This Day in Weather History with me, your host, Chris May.